Hi everyone, welcome to this afternoon's webinar looking at resource management and in particular energy. My name's Karen, most of you know me I think. I work for Discover the World Education and I've been delivering quite a few of the webinars during our sort of special series during this unprecedented time. Today we're going to be focusing on Iceland as a case study and looking at the strategies that they have for their energy production and providing you with plenty of opportunities to really think like geographers. Energy is fundamental to human development. We need as geographers to consider the energy mix, our reliance on non-renewable fossil fuels and the growing significance of renewables, the reduction of supplies of coal, gas and oil, and the economic and environmental issues associated with the exploitation of energy resources. The aims of this webinar are to look at the global distribution of energy consumption and supply, the reasons for increased energy consumption, factors affecting energy supply, and the impacts of energy insecurity. We're then going to consider some of the strategies used to increase energy supply, particularly looking at renewable sources of energy. And then we're going to consider Iceland as a case study for renewable energy strategies, both geothermal energy and hydroelectric energy. Energy is needed for a range of activities, including lighting, cooking, heating, agriculture, fueling, transport, and powering industry. As a country becomes increasingly developed, its demand for energy grows. This graph shows the dramatic increase in global primary energy consumption over the last 70 years. In 1965, the bulk of total energy was consumed by North America, Europe, and Eurasia collectively. They accounted for more than 80% of global energy consumption. Although energy consumption has increased in these regions since the 60s, their relative share of the total has declined significantly, and consumption across the rest of the world has been increasing, most dramatically in the Asia Pacific, where the total consumption increased more than 12-fold over this period. This map illustrates the global distribution of energy consumption, and clear geographic areas highlighted here are North America has a very high consumption, as does Australia and the Scandinavian countries, including Iceland. Africa and South America are very low, with Europe and North Asia kind of hovering in the middle. Let's look at this information in a little bit more detail and consider the top performers. So, the 10 countries with the lowest consumption per person are, for example, the Gaza Strip, Chad, Guinea-Bissau, Somalia, Sierra Leone. Basically, 10 countries with quite low economic countries and in very early stages of their development. We can compare this consumption to the countries, the top 10, with the highest levels of electricity consumption, not just energy consumption, but electricity consumption. And as you can see, all of these high-income countries in the latter stages of development. You can see here that Iceland ranks as number 1. And we need to use our critical thinking skills here to understand why this is actually the case. We'll discover that later. So let's look at the reasons for the rapid increase in energy consumption. As a country develops economically, demand for energy grows. And as a country becomes more developed, there is a higher demand for food, leading to more intensive farming techniques. These technologies require additional energy to power machinery, provide lighting and heating. The processing, manufacturing and transportation of food also lead to increased energy demands. And as agriculture shifts from subsistence to commercial farming as a country develops, the demand for energy also increases. As improvements in living standards continue across the world to grow, car ownership has also continued to grow. And despite advances in the efficiency of engines, car manufacturing places considerable demands on energy. Demand for energy increases with urbanisation. As more people live in urban areas, the demand for energy for lighting, cooking, domestic appliances also increases. And in the future, urbanisation will continue to place high demands on energy in the lesser developed regions in Africa, Asia, and South America. As people become wealthier, their demand for energy grows with increased purchases of domestic appliances, leisure and recreation activities, global energy supplies, and these will significantly increase in highly populated, newly emerging economies such as India, China, and Brazil. And then we have an increased demand for energy because of the rapidly growing population. Since 1950, the world's population has increased considerably, leading to the growth in demand for energy. And the overwhelming majority of this growth has been in the low-income countries and the newly emerging economies, where there is already an energy deficit. Population growth is most significant in Asia and Africa, where there is a considerable energy insecurity, and this provision will be a significant challenge in the future. So now let's look at the factors affecting energy availability. First of all, we have the physical factors. Geology affects the availability of fossil fuels, such as oil, natural gas, and coal. The formation of fossil fuels involves the storage of organic matters in sediments or sedimentary rocks. Regions with predominantly sedimentary geology are likely to have an availability of fossil fuels. Climate and relief can also affect the extraction of fossil fuels, and mountainous areas like this one here and regions with extreme climates present challenges for the extraction of fossil fuels and their transportation. Examples of such areas are Alaska and Siberia. Considerable reserves of fossil fuels are found beneath deep and dangerous oceans and seas. This presents significant challenges in extracting the fossil fuels, and it is well documented that the oil rigs are one of the most dangerous places to be. Physical factors can present some opportunities for renewable energy. The upland areas ideally suited for the construction of dams and reservoirs to support the production of hydroelectric power. And areas with reliable sunshine can be used to generate solar energy. And finally, windy locations can be used to create electricity using wind turbines like these ones in the uplands of Scotland. Geothermally active areas are particularly important during this particular webinar, as we will focus later on the geothermal energy strategies used in Iceland. As well as the physical factors, we also have to consider the cost of exploitation and production. As non-renewable energy resources become depleted, they become increasingly expensive to extract. This cost of exploitation increases with supply and demand. Demand increases, prices rise, and extraction then becomes more viable. Where costs of energy production are low, energy is cheap and demand also grows. The opposite can also occur. Technology and developments and the sharing of skills and ideas around the world have enabled new energy resources to be explored. For example, fracking. There has been considerable growth in renewable energy, and technology has made this more economically viable and productive. Political factors, and when thinking like a geographer, political factors are becoming even more important now. Conflicts have often occurred as a result of energy insecurities, for example, in the Middle East, and flows of energy can be disrupted and interrupted as a result of these disputes and conflicts. For example, Libya, the oil exports have really been reduced due to the conflict there. And to maintain energy supply, high-income countries actively maintain good relationships with foreign countries. And these good relationships can be illustrated by global energy securities. Energy security is largely determined by energy supply and demand. Most of the world will experience energy insecurity at some point, and this map shows that despite having a high reliance on imports, places like North America and Europe are largely energy secure. However, large areas of Central and Southern Africa, Asia and South America experience energy insecurity. It's all about connections and relationships. So what are the impacts of energy security? Energy security can lead to social, environmental, and economic impacts. The exploration of sensitive areas as energy demand increases and availability decreases, the exploration in sensitive areas and environments becomes more common. Drilling for oil in Siberia and Alaska threatens the fragile polar and tundra environments, and areas of rainforest have been cleared in tropical areas to make way for biofuel. The construction of dams and reservoirs has led to valleys being flooded, displacing thousands of people, the loss of farmland, and the destruction of ecosystems. An example of this is the Three Gorges Dam in China. The controversial construction of renewable energy, such as wind and solar farms in popular upland areas such as the Scottish Highlands and the Lake District, plus hydroelectric power in the highlands of Iceland, which we shall look at later. All of these are sensitive areas, very fragile environments that are being damaged, perhaps at sort of like the risk of this economic development. It is expensive to extract energy resources from remote and environmentally sensitive locations, and this leads to an increase in the price of energy, which will be met ultimately by the consumer. As economic development continues across the globe, the demand for energy continues to increase, and agricultural output will continue to grow. This is particularly the case in areas devoid of natural energy resources that are already experiencing energy insecurity, and this then leads to an increase in food prices. Industrial output can also be affected by energy insecurity and fluctuating prices. As a result of this, prices can increase with growing uncertainty. Companies based in these countries that experience energy insecurity therefore experience considerable challenges in competing with those countries with energy security, reducing economic output in the newly emerging economies. And then finally, we have conflict. In countries where there is energy insecurity, there are conflicts between the different sectors, including industry, domestic users, and agriculture. And it may be up to the government to prioritise energy users. Countries that have energy insecurity may flood the markets in regions affected by those who have an energy insecurity, and tariffs and other controls may have to be introduced to protect the home market. Energy insecurity can lead to international political conflicts, such as disputes along the gas pipeline from Russia to the West. Energy is typically delivered as electricity, and this can be generated by burning fossil fuels or mechanically using wind or water to turn turbines. In order to increase energy supply, we can either burn more fossil fuels or develop alternative renewable energy sources which are more sustainable and less damaging to the environment. This graph shows how fuels are currently used to generate electricity. And what we need to do here is to see a shift from the majority being non-renewable to actually the renewables. Renewable energy resources are increasingly being used to generate electricity. And what we need to do is look at each one in turn to see which one is the best for that particular country. Biomass, hydroelectric power, wave energy, wind energy, solar energy, tidal energy, and geothermal energy. Each of these have their own advantages and disadvantages, and it is a fine balance to see which one is going to actually produce enough supply to meet the demand. So how can we move towards these more sustainable energy supplies? A sustainable energy supply balances supply and demand. We need to develop more renewable energy supplies. We need to conserve energy by reducing waste. We need to improve fuel efficiency, and we need to efficiently use the fossil fuels. Through increasing our use of renewable energy and reducing our use of fossil fuels, we can then increase fuel efficiency and conservation. We can then reduce our carbon footprint. And then finally, a sustainable energy supply has the following characteristics. It does not damage the natural environment. It involves and benefits not only the global community, but also the local community. It can be applied to both high-income countries and low-income countries, and it supports the local economy. So now let's concentrate on our case study of energy in Iceland. Evidence shows that in order to really think like a geographer, you need to have a more detailed understanding of the country. And I would encourage you to really independently look at the countries you study, as it will really help you to have an understanding of the culture, the physical aspects, the social aspects, the political aspects, and the environmental aspects of a country that really allow you to think like geographers. So let's look a little bit at Iceland. Iceland has a population of just 350,000 people. 78% of its population live in the area around Reykjavik and its suburbs, as highlighted here on this particular map. The rest of the country is quite sparsely populated. It is ideal for renewable energy sources. 100% of Iceland's energy comes from renewable energy sources, hydroelectric power and geothermal power. They're also looking a little bit at wind power as well. It is ideal. They have plenty of geothermal areas, as can be seen from this map on the right-hand side, and they have plenty of sources for hydroelectric power due to the number of glaciers and rivers and the landscape in this particular area. Geothermal energy, why is this so important in Iceland, and why is it such a good place for Iceland? Iceland is the only place on the mid-Atlantic ridge that is above the Atlantic Ocean. The plates on this particular area are moving apart. They are a constructive divergent plate margin. The magma in this particular area is very close to the surface. It is a hot spot area. So therefore, in order to produce geothermal energy where you have to drill the water down, because the magma is close to the surface, this makes it the perfect location for geothermal energy. You can see here where the mid-Atlantic ridge is, and this picture here is just showing you the boundary of the mid-Atlantic ridge where the plates are moving apart. In terms of hydroelectric power, Iceland has the ideal environment. We've already seen that it has plenty of glaciers and highland areas, and these produce high velocity rivers in the spring and summer. They also have, as you can see from this climate graph, consistently high rainfall throughout the year. There is plenty of groundwater flow, making water in abundance. It is sparsely populated, so therefore the impact of dams and reservoirs is slightly less, although we will look at this point a little later because things in Iceland are starting to change. Let's look at the energy production then in Iceland. 73% of the energy produced in Iceland is from hydroelectric power, and just under 27% is geothermal. And as you can see, they do have a little bit of wind production as well. So all of these are renewable sources, and they are well on their way to becoming a carbon neutral country by 2030. They were the first country in the world to create an economy generated through industries fueled by renewable energy. And this is actually aluminium, and I will focus on that in just a little while. You can see that in the at the early 2000s, late 1990s, there was a real sudden increase in demand for energy. This wasn't particularly because the population started to increase at that time. You can see that there was a steady rise before then. It was literally because of the increase in industry in the Icelandic areas, and I will focus on this just a little bit more. So let's look at geothermal energy in Iceland. Iceland has been harnessing geothermal energy since 1908. There are now 5 major plants, and they produce 30% of the country's electricity and 87% of the country's hot water. So how does geothermal energy work? Water from the ground is pumped down. It is superheated, and then the steam is passed through a turbine which generates the electricity. The hot water is then piped out to the different urban areas, so therefore the country has a a constant supply of hot water. This particular slide shows Hellisheiði geothermal power station. It's the largest in Iceland and the 6th largest in the world. It's considered to be the most advanced in terms of its technology in the world. It's the most forward-thinking, and the skills and techniques used by the scientists and engineers in Iceland are being shared all around the world, particularly in some newly emerging economies, such as Indonesia, who also has vast amounts of geothermal energy. At Hellisheiði power station, we have 6 high-pressure turbines and 30 wells. The boreholes take the water 2 to 3 kilometres down towards the magma. This water is then superheated, the steam rises up, and it's propelled through these turbines for electricity generation. It's very, very cheap. On average, an Icelandic household, a family of maybe 4 or 5 people, pays on average £17 per month for their hot water and electricity. And I can tell you that here in the UK, the average price for hot water and electricity and all the energy that we need to run our houses is around about £200 a month. So you can really see the difference between us and Iceland. If you're interested in Hellisheiði and geothermal power, there are 2 amazing YouTube videos that you can watch here. They're between 6 and 10 minutes each, that's all. And they will give you lots of information as well as a fantastic tour around the Hellisheiði power plant. So what are the benefits of geothermal energy in Iceland? In terms of farming, they are able to harness the geothermal energy very much locally to heat and light greenhouses. In Húsavík, which is one of the northernmost towns in Iceland, they have a very large geothermal greenhouse area, and they are able to produce over 500 tonnes of tomatoes each year. That is 50% of the domestic consumption. In another area in the southwest of Iceland, in a small area called Friðheimar, they produce 370 tonnes of Iceland, so again, another 30% of the domestic consumption. And just between these 2 geothermal areas, some years they have enough tomatoes to actually export the tomatoes to other Nordic countries. They also grow strawberries and peppers and are able to produce enough mushrooms to meet the demand for the whole of the year from Iceland. So therefore they are producing 100% of their domestic consumption within their country. It seems incredible to say that when you're looking at a country that has the most the very, very short growing season. You know, in some days in the winter, you only get 3 or 4 hours dusk. It never really gets light. The summer months are really only from May to September, but within this short amount of time, you know, and because they are able to light and heat their greenhouses 365 days a year, they're able to produce enough tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, strawberries, and mushrooms to meet the needs of the nation in terms of that fresh fruit. So let's look at afforestation. And you may be wondering what this has got to do with geothermal energy, but this really highlights the amazing butterfly effect that actually having a renewable, sustainable, plentiful energy resource has. Iceland has a goal to create 5% forest cover over the next 50 years. The country was extensively deforested in Viking times, but as we know, having trees actually reduces the carbon footprint of a country. And part of the Iceland's climate plan is to plant on average 4 million trees per year. This will be a fundamental part of achieving carbon neutral status. It also helps to protect the soils from wind and water erosion. So we know all that, but why has geothermal energy got anything to do with afforestation? So the geothermally heated water is a key part of this strategy. The trees are grown quickly in designated greenhouses, and the warm water is then used to irrigate the soils and the land, so the growing season is extended. And the soils and the land of these areas that are to be afforested are actually kept ice and frost free, so the growing season is extended. Again, a fantastic YouTube clip here where you can look and see some of the developments that are being made in foresting the areas in Iceland. So, Reykjavik, the northernmost capital in the world, it sits at just around about 66 degrees north. And the top of Iceland is about 44 kilometres away from the Arctic Circle. Yet you can walk around Reykjavik in the middle of the winter and have completely snow and ice-free pavements and roads. And this is because they have underfloor heating in some of the main parts of Reykjavik. You can see there, and those of you at home, you might have underfloor heating and you will have a mini mat like that picture on the top there, maybe on your kitchen or your bathroom floor. But because they have quite a considerable amount of cheap energy and hot water, they are able to run these sort of like underground heating systems in the city centre during the winter months. It's quite an impressive thing to see when you're walking around the city and the fields and the park areas and some of the sort of like out of town areas are under a metre of snow, yet the streets and the walkways in Reykjavik are completely clear. Iceland is at the forefront of worldwide developments of geothermal energy production, and it is considered to be the world leaders in terms of innovation and education. George is an Icelandic development company which aims to strengthen research and development in the field of geothermal energy. Its main aim is to reduce emissions worldwide and to increase sustainable energy. For Iceland, their aim is to be energy independent and then to be a carbon neutral society. They work heavily with the European Commission and global groups towards worldwide sustainable development goals. They also look at new concepts and clean energy transition activities, plus they develop framework programs for research and technological development across the world. What's most interesting about George is that they are working with the British Geological Survey, as well as 38 institutes and companies from 11 countries around the world, to start to develop the Iceland-Europe interconnector. And this is considered to be a lifeline for Europe in terms of energy. It's called the IceLink, and basically what will happen is they are thinking about putting a very large electricity cable, technically, an interconnector, a power interconnector between Iceland and the top of Scotland, so that we can harness the geothermal energy from Iceland and we can use it within Britain and then within Europe. Okay, and I want you to really think about what that could do for our energy supplies. We wouldn't be quite so reliant on other countries. We would be more reliant on Iceland, but actually it would quite possibly lead to us being more energy secure. Inevitably, with geothermal energy, there will be some issues, but these are considered to be fairly minor. The release of hydrogen sulfide is a gas that smells like rotten eggs, and you can walk around some areas of Iceland and actually you can smell this. It's not going to do you any harm. It doesn't smell very nice, but you do get used to it, and you know, it is quite commonplace. There is also some within geothermal fluids a very, very low level of toxic material, but the geothermal energy plants work very, very hard on keeping this as low as possible, and it's not considered to be toxic in the areas. And the other worry, of course, is that eventually some areas may cool down. However, if you are a country that sits on the mid-Atlantic ridge, this is unlikely to be the case. So let's now look at hydroelectric power. 73% of the energy in Iceland comes from hydroelectric power, and this is used both to produce electricity for homes and for industry. The electricity, the hydroelectric power, started in 1904, and over the next sort of like century, there are now many, many hydroelectric power plants around Iceland. It's a very simple concept. You have water which is stored behind a dam, and then that water flows through the turbines, which generates the electricity, and the power then can be transported to wherever it is needed and in demand. It's sustainable, it's renewable, but it's not without controversy. There is an increased demand for energy due to industry. We talked a couple of slides ago about this sort of dramatic increase in the mid-1990s, early 2000s, this demand for more and more energy. And the main reason for that was because they started to bring aluminium as an industry into Iceland. The Americans, the Australians and the British saw that there was sort of like, you know, a capacity for this because of the very, very cheap energy. And aluminium processing and smelting needs huge amounts of power in order to sort of run the processing plant. Aluminium has been a large focus for industry in Iceland for some time, and at its peak it accounted for over 25% of its economy. So you can see here in 2010 it was sitting at around about 26%, the second highest sector of the economy. Several power stations were constructed just for producing power for the aluminium. And one such example was the Karinjaka hydroelectric plant. And this dam is the centrepiece of 5 major dams having been opened amongst much controversy in 2009. And it was at the peak of aluminium's importance in the Icelandic economy. It is the largest of its kind in Europe. There are 5 dams in 2 glacial rivers, which created 3 reservoirs that together flooded over 440,000 acres of highland territory. It's a mega structure that Iceland has never seen before and actually hasn't seen since. Environmental groups have strictly opposed its operation due to the irreversible environmental damage to the surrounding area. Habitats of pink-footed geese and wild reindeer were lost, and both the hydroelectric power and the aluminium plants have been criticised for exploiting foreign workers and for not keeping monies earned within this aluminium processing within the Icelandic economy. The aluminium plants that we can see here are owned by the American and the Anglo-Australasian TNCs. The Rio Tinto plant here on the right-hand side is in Hafnarfjordur near Reykjavik. It is also the site of controversy. This plant has been the centre of much discussion over the last couple of years, and it is thought to be on the verge of closing. I was reading an article on it this morning, And they were saying from there that actually, they really do believe that this is going to close within the next couple of months. The main reasons cited for this closure are the increased energy prices and the fact that much of the profit is going out of Iceland. And actually, the local economy, as well as the national economy, are not benefiting at all. As you can see from this graph, aluminium production is in steady decline. Construction of a new plant in East Iceland has been halted pending review. And this shows that there is a very fine balance with development. And in order for it to be sustainable, all three pillars of sustainable development, local, environmental, and economical, have to be considered. And we'll look at this concept a little bit further in a minute. The environmental movement has arguably been a part of Icelandic society since as early as 1907, when efforts were made to fight the rise in soil erosion. In the same year, the iconic waterfall Gullfoss, which is probably the most famous waterfall in Iceland, was subject to an ownership bid. A British businessman, Howe, proposed to Gullfoss's then owner, Thomas Thomason, that he would buy the waterfall and utilise its raw power by constructing a hydroelectric dam. For many years after, Thomas's daughter Sigurdur was entangled in a legal battle in order to save the waterfall from development. Her passion and drive was so forceful that on many occasions she would walk barefoot across the lava fields from Gullfoss to Reykjavik, which is just over 120 kilometres, just to make her concerns heard. She also threatened to throw herself into the waterfall should the construction begin. The land was eventually sold to the Icelandic government at a very, very low cost, and it is now protected with national park status. She is often cited as Iceland's first environmentalist, and I believe that there are stark similarities to another young lady whose passion and drive is now respected worldwide. Saving Iceland is a well-respected environmental group who work with the government and communities to try and ensure that the fine balance between development and conservation is met. They have composed this map, which illustrates proposed developments for energy production in Iceland for the future. As you can see, some involve the damming of glacial rivers and exploiting the geothermal areas. Many of these projects are in the early planning stages, and the Icelandic government needs to carefully ensure that they are fully sustainable. Iceland's current Prime Minister is an amazing forward-thinking politician called Katrín Jakobsdóttir. Katrín has been nominated alongside Richard Attenborough for the Chatham House Award. Her nomination is actually for the groundbreaking work on equality for all, but she is also a keen environmentalist and is working hard to ensure that Iceland's development, particularly in terms of energy, is sustainable for all. We already know from our earlier slide that per capita, Iceland's electricity consumption is the highest in the world. But remember, this is per capita. They have a very low population with several high energy aluminium plants. They also don't have oil or gas for heating or cooking. Everything is electric. So this is where we need to critically think, because this statistic could be slightly skewed. But even so, Katrín recently conceded that if everybody lived like the Icelanders, we would need 6 planets, maybe more. As such, she is educating their society and encouraging them to be more efficient with their energy use. So sustainable development has 3 main pillars, as can be seen from this diagram: economic value, benefit to society, and environmental integrity. It is development at a place that the country and its population can cope with. Iceland is at a critical point where they have realised that some development, which could be to their economic value and benefit, has had to move at a slower pace in order to ensure that the benefits to society and the environmental integrity are met. So, In conclusion, as countries develop, demand for electricity goes up. The richest countries in the world, 1 billion population, use 50% of the world's energy, whereas the poorer countries of the world only use 20% of the world's energy. Few countries have supplies and deposits of fossil fuels, and not all countries have solar, wind, geothermal, or tidal energy. The energy gap is getting bigger, and demand is going to eventually outweigh the supply. We will in the future have to look at countries like Iceland, who have an abundant and renewable energy source, but we have to balance that economy and that development with the local needs of the people and also the environment. It is even more important now that as geographers, we really start to think like geographers and consider all aspects: the social, the physical, the environmental, the economical, and the political. And then we look at this from a local scale as well as a global scale, now and in the future. We also need to consider the bias. What are we reading in the news? What are we reading in the media? And we need to critically think beyond this bias. It's so important that now we treat the earth well. It was not given to you by your parents. It was loaned to you by your children. I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. I hope that you found this webinar interesting. We have done 2 previous series of webinars which might be able to help you with some of your studies for your GCSE and A-levels. And we do have 2 really interesting webinars next week, which also might help you. The one on Monday is all to do with rivers and coasts, particularly focusing on Iceland. So that will help you with your revision and your studies. And then a very special webinar on Thursday to finish our series, which is a joint webinar with Richard Waller, and we are looking at the aspects of climate change, focusing on the Icelandic glaciers to show the impact of that. In the meantime, have a wonderful rest of the afternoon, and I will speak to you all again soon. I've just had a message through YouTube saying that we can share the presentations. And yes, I will make these available at the end of all of our series. So if you email us at the company, Discover the World Education, you will find our email addresses on the website. If you drop me a message, then I can share this presentation through to you. Thank you very much. Take care and see you all soon.